Righty-ho, so this is a PowerPoint on Mr. Birling. Now remember, with Mr. Birling, any question on him, you want to bring in the idea of how he's presented, and he's presented as the archetypal capitalistic man. He is meant to be a representation of capitalism, and therefore he is oppositional or opposite to everything that J.B. Priestley as a socialist believes is right. So Mr. Birling is going to be seen as the antithesis of all that J.B. Priestley believes in, and therefore you're going to get a picture of him as a character. He's quite a flat character, not really capable of change, and that is one of the ways that we see him as negative. However, we always remember counter arguments, so there are going to be some elements within Mr. Birling that you have to see as positive. Okay, the first time that you see him is in that tableau, that opening tableau in the stage directions. Remember, they're very important because they those stage directions give you this exposition of all of the characters. So the characters are exposed. A couple of key words for Birling: he's pretentious, that self-important quality of him. He sees himself as a hard-headed man of business. Now that is, he says that repeatedly throughout, and you remember, that shows actually a lack of confidence, because if you need to repeat who you are and what you are, rather than just allow people to see that perhaps suggests that you're not confident that you actually come across that way. So if you always have to say that you're a hard-headed man of business, there must be something in your demeanour that perhaps doesn't allow people to see you as that authority figure. Also, you've got within Mr. Birling that idea that perhaps his background is not equal to that of his wife. He has provincial way of speaking. Remember, that's perhaps with a slight accent or using colloquialisms from the north of England, where he must be from, and therefore he hasn't been able to eradicate his past, which is ironic because he has been able to eradicate his past, rather, in relation to his thinking. He doesn't have any sense of sympathy or responsibility for people who may be from a similar background to him. So perhaps the working class foundations that are within Birling, they've been completely eradicated. He sees himself staunchly now as an upper middle class, hard-headed man of business. That's quite hard to say. But there is also the tension then with Birling and his wife in that opening tableau, because she is her husband's social superior. This idea then, well, why did they get married? Because she obviously could have done better for herself. And that perhaps is open to interpretation, but one of the interpretations that you have to bear in mind is that maybe they got married because they loved each other, which would have been quite a rebellious thing in the late Victorian era, for a marriage like that to be based on affection and love rather than just on the accumulation of wealth or influence. The first time Birling speaks, he's talking about the port, and remember, he wants to make it very clear to Gerald that this is the same port that his dad buys. Why does he do that? Because he wants to ingratiate himself with Gerald. He wants Gerald to think, oh, my dad and Mr. Birling like the same sort of port, therefore they must be men of equal stature in society, which is not the case, because Gerald's father is Sir Gerald Croft, so he is Sir Croft, he is a man of influence, the sort of influence that Birling aspires to. And of course, if everything goes well with the New Year's honour list, then Birling will get his knighthood. But of course we know that it's all going to go Pete Tonglen wrong. Okay, the first time that you see Birling in action, really, on the stage, he has that idea that he is beaming at his family, which makes him seem quite warm. But really, that smile is a smile perhaps that relates more to a proprietorial instinct, that this is his property. These people are part of his property, and to have them all together gives him this enormous sense of well-being. He's masterful, he's relaxed, and he repeats the word nice. This is nice, he says. And again, there's obvious pleasure, but also too it perhaps suggests some weakness or limitation. At this momentous moment where his only daughter is to become engaged to a man of greater social stature, the only word that he can think of at that time is nice, and perhaps there are subtle criticisms there already. Okay, first sort of source of tension that is apparent is when Mrs. Birling speaks stage direction there reproachfully to her husband, because what he's done is he's made a social faux pas or a social mistake in that he wants to congratulate the cook for an excellent meal. However, you don't congratulate a cook for an excellent meal. That's the cook's job. Therefore, you would expect the meal to be excellent. After all, you're paying her wages. But that perhaps links back to the legacy of Mr. Birling, his more humble origins. And it's quite an endearing thing that he wants to thank the cook, but the reproachfulness in his wife's voice makes it clear that she is his social superior. What it also makes clear is that she's alert to the faults in others. She's aware of moments when other people make mistakes. She's not aware when she makes her own mistakes. There's this lack of self-awareness for her. But what it also does is, because Gerald's there and they're trying to impress him, and so if she speaks reproachfully to her husband, it creates a source of tension. It's a little bit embarrassing. And again, she's not aware that she does that. She brings the embarrassment and the tension into the room because she feels the need to criticise her husband. You've got that subtext. What is the story below the words, hidden below the words? And you have that with drama, so make sure that you can allude to it and suggest, the subtext here suggests something. And what it suggests is the social gap that exists between the husband and wife. Birling's response to his wife's reproaches, come, and it's quite ineffectual. But what it does is suggest that he's used to these sort of reproaches from his wife. This is obviously something that he is not startled by. And his ineffectual response of come means that he's trying to placate her. He's trying to please her. He doesn't feel antagonised by her. Maybe he's very clear that she's the one that wears the trousers in this household. The first time that you see Birling really speaking with Gerald, he makes allusions to several of the themes. Remember, we've got age, class, responsibility and gender. And when he's speaking to Gerald, he really sort of combines all those themes together. It's very clear when he says that Gerald is the kind of son-in-law I always wanted, which really does smack at the dissatisfaction that he must have in relation to Eric. The kind of son-in-law I always wanted, which it just sounds a bit mean. And what also you have then too is when he's speaking to Gerald, he speaks more in relation to you and I. So he uses pronouns to suggest the business relationship between Gerald and Mr. Birling, rather than she and her, putting the onus on his desire for his daughter's happiness. And by doing that, by making the pronouns link more to you and I, it suggests that this is a marriage of convenience in relation to his business. Throughout, you just can't help but mention that Birling is that symbol of capitalism. He's antagonistic to the beliefs of the playwright, and therefore we are going to get quite a severe portrayal of Birling. And he's not going to come across, as a character that has, many admirable traits. What we do have is this idea that perhaps he's a little bit two-dimensional, that he has made sure that he has a course that his life will follow. His ultimate destination is wealth and influence. That's what he wants. And he's not going to let anything take him away from that course. He suffers, like his wife does, with this sense of moral myopia, short-sightedness. He cannot see how his actions affect others. So even in that previous phrase where he says to Gerald, "You're the kind of son-in-law I've always wanted," he doesn't see how that's a dig at Eric, though we as an audience do. So there is that element of dramatic irony there. Okay, now with the initial understanding of Birling, what you have is the importance of monologues. Monologues. Okay, Birling speaking by himself to the others. And what he does is he betrays himself in his monologues. He allows his flaws to shine in his monologues, but he does this unwittingly. It shows again his lack of self-awareness, because he talks at that time, at this centerpiece, this important monologue. He talks about how the Titanic is unsinkable. He talks about how war is just never going to happen. He talks about how Sheila and Gerald will, in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, they'll be enjoying peace and prosperity. But what you have there with those monologues is an understanding of how limited Birling's understanding of the world is. He has that moral myopia, and also I suppose he has a political myopia. He doesn't understand he doesn't understand how things may pan out in the future. He just has a very short-term view based on his knowledge of the present. For Birling, his politics are related to self-reliance, and what he thinks are his responsibilities are purely capitalist ones, that it's my responsibility to make money, it's my responsibility to keep wages low and prices high, because the profit that results will therefore allow me to be that successful, hard-headed man of business. Money is really what dominates Birling in the way that he thinks, and again, that idea of his daughter's engagement is some sort of financial move. He brings that up. His use of the pronoun as well, the focus on you and I superseding her and she, make that obvious. What he represents is, again, the antithesis, the complete opposite of Priestley's thinking. And really what Birling does is he dismisses any man who thinks differently. Left-leaning writers, he brings up H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw. And why he does that is because he hates anything that's progressive. He hates anything that's different from his own way of thinking. He cannot be, I suppose, he cannot be misdirected, or he cannot veer off his path towards money and influence. Okay, Birling as a poor parent. Well, already you've had his speech about the marriage and how it'll bring the Crofts and the Birlings together for lower wages and higher prices. But during the monologue, in which we have that real exposition of dramatic irony, where we understand the Titanic sinks, we understand that war happened, what you have is Eric's interjection where he says, "What about war?" And his dad just rants off about how Eric, is wrong to think this way. And when his dad reacts in such an aggressive means and criticizes Eric for asking what seems like a reasonable question, that is a metaphor, okay? That piece of action is metaphorically meant to represent how Birling chooses to dismiss or drown out the voice of opposition, but not just Birling, capitalism, because remember that's what he represents, that there's no doubt in Birling's mind that he owns the room, he understands everything, and how could his son be so stupid? And therefore you have this idea that he is a man whose parental responsibilities are in doubt. He says later on in Act 1 to Gerald, you could have done rather better for yourself. He actually acknowledges his daughter as socially inferior. And that seems a very hard thing for a father to do. When Birling goes on with another one of his monologues, what he tries to do is he shares his personal philosophy with Gerald and Eric, and you get the understanding that Eric's probably heard this several times before, maybe Gerald has too. But the syntax, the word order, the way that he structures this is important, because he says that a man has to look after himself, and then you have that hyphen and his family too, of course. And the hyphen and the sentence structure there, perhaps, they're indicative. That what they do is they indicate that for Birling, his first thoughts are about looking after himself. And again, it relates back to that idea of self-interest. Anybody who thinks differently to him is a crank. So socialism the political ideology that J.B. Priestley would find himself linked to, that is dismissed in terms of just being a crank. And what you have here is you have that idea that, again, he dismisses anything that is outside his own understanding of the world. He also uses a metaphor himself where he says that socialism would have us all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. Just look at that wee phrase, community and all that nonsense. And what Birling thinks that he's doing there is making a very cogent and making a very clear argument. But really he isn't, because we know that bees in a hive are perhaps one of the most communally successful societies, that they work together for the success of all, and therefore to use them to criticize socialism doesn't really work, because a beehive is organizationally perfect in terms of how it operates, and therefore again we see the limitations of Birling's understanding. Okay, Birling and lighting. Now remember, lighting is really important, because so far we've had the kind of cosy pink lighting, given that sort of intimacy to the evening, and then Birling requests more light, and for the entrance of the inspector. And it's maybe ironic that he's the one that requests more light, because he doesn't really want to. He doesn't want to shine light on this situation. He doesn't want to have his understanding or perceptions brightened. He's happy to stay on his little path towards capitalism and success. So the harder, brighter light stage directions again that accompany Gould's arrival, it's quite ironic that it's Birling who requests that more light, because he does not want to be enlightened. Okay, class. Birling and class, that theme, they are inseparable, because what you have here, you have this idea that Birling understands class. He understands how it works. Remember, he's had first-hand experience, because he's worked his way up, but you would think that would make him perhaps more receptive to the sufferings of the lower class, but really it doesn't at all. He did not worry about firing the girls who led the strike. He didn't think twice about it, just the way Sheila didn't think twice about having Eva sacked. You know, it's never an issue. And perhaps one of the ways that we should bear that in mind is the way that Edna, who is the servant, the way that she's treated, she's never thought of, apart from the fact that she does her duty and she's expected to do her duty. So the working classes are, I suppose, the silent presence within the play. Remember, Eva is a flawless representation of the working class, and yet she never speaks. We only hear of her through the voices of others. Again, for Edna's silence is representative of how the working classes don't have a voice. Okay, with Birling's confession then, one of the important things is that just as it's about to begin, Gerald tries to leave. He probably senses the embarrassment of the occasion, and he doesn't really want to be linked to what may be a scandal. And it's funny because Birling uses Gerald's social standing in order to influence the inspector. He says, you know, this is Gerald Croft, you know, son of Lord and Lady, or Sir Croft and Lady Croft, as if that would influence the inspector, as if it would hold sway, because it obviously influences Birling. And the inspector reacts as if it does for a second, and then says, no, you need to stay. And really what that does is it sends the message to Birling that class and influence of class and nepotism, which is when you use your influential friends to try and benefit yourself, they will not work here with the inspector. Birling doesn't think how any reaction or any association with Eva Smith could be important, but the inspector disagrees and says what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards, and what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide, a chain of events. Because the inspector looks back, he looks at the present, and he looks towards the future. Whereas what I've said before about Birling is that he is on this narrow path, always heading in that direction. He is short-sighted, that myopic strain within him. Whereas you have the understanding that the inspector's viewpoint is panoramic and beyond just the present. He looks back and he looks forward. He can understand that these things happen, that there is a chain, and that's not what we get from Birling. Birling is on this very narrow road. Okay, now, when Birling is talking about Eva, he doesn't deny that she was a lively, good-looking girl and that she was a good worker. But he understands, that she was there in the forefront of that strike. What he says is that he refused their pay request. But what he also does is he shows this lack of self-awareness, because he says that Eva was a good worker. And therefore, if she were a good worker, if he understood that she was a good worker, then would it not be in his interest to try and maybe delegate and negotiate with her rather than just sack her? Because that's what a hard-headed man of business does. A hard-headed man of business understands, okay, well, what's good for my business? Good workers are. These workers are not on side. They want a particular thing. What I'll do is I'll delegate and negotiate, and I'll keep my workforce happy, and therefore my profits will continue. But he doesn't do that. What he does is he sees her as a good worker, but she was a threat to him. The fact that she wanted more money was a threat to him, and therefore he acted in a way that was quite defensive. Now, can you imagine a hard-headed man of business being threatened by a young girl? Well, that's the way that he saw it. So, in sacking Eva, he thought he was being very powerful as a boss, but actually, was he not just being weak? Because he couldn't delegate, he couldn't negotiate with her, he didn't go down that route, he just sacked her. And perhaps that shows weakness rather than power. When the inspector interrupts Birling to say why he didn't just raise the rate, Birling says in an irritable way, I don't like that tone. If they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. She had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. Again, she had a lot to say, too much, that idea that she was a threat to him. And Birling acts, again, defensively here. I don't like your tone. So, again, not that he can just justify himself, but that he is being defensive, which again suggests weakness, not confidence. Gerald Croft, being the kind of son-in-law that you would always want, backs Birling up, couldn't have done anything else, and it reaffirms that the shared connection that they have, they are parallel characters. They're travelling the same route, aren't they? They're just the same sort of people. But Eric isn't a parallel character to his dad. He shows a contrast. Eric is a foil, the opposite of his dad, because he says, she couldn't have gone somewhere else necessarily. And what he does is he shows some empathy towards Eva. That's important, because so far you've had this idea that Eric is perhaps immature, that he drinks a little bit too much, that he is a little bit childlike in the way that he operates with Sheila. But the fact that he can empathise with Eva perhaps suggests that a capacity within him to progress, that he may not just be a flat character like his dad, that he could be more rounded. As a father, we've already had that idea that Birling drowns out the voice of the opposition when Eric tried to ask about war. But also too, you've got this uneasiness or this discomfort in that when Birling realises that perhaps the inspector isn't just there to see him, that Eric and Sheila and Gerald might be involved, there's a marked change in his tone. A marked change, i.e. he becomes less defensive, and therefore what it does is it suggests that he's the sort of father who would prefer that his children were implicated rather than just he was implicated in the death of Eva. So he wants the idea of that blame to be something that's not just on his shoulders, but would rather be something that's shared on to perhaps his children. And that's quite selfish. It's hard really to justify that. That again, that goes back to this self-interest of the capitalist. As a father in Act 2, that becomes also a little bit more obvious, because what he does is he actually tries to defend Gerald's infidelity rather than be angry, rather than be protective of his daughter. He tries to defend Gerald. And again, you're wondering, is that because he wants the connection with Gerald in the business way rather than maybe a personal thing? It's about safeguarding the business. When it comes to Birling and responsibilities, the inspector reminds the inspector reminds Birling of his responsibilities. And what you have here is that socialist message that Priestley is trying to pass on, that everybody has to look out for each other. And the inspector reminds Birling that public people have responsibilities as well as privileges, because for Birling, he wants all of the privileges of being upper middle class, but he doesn't want any of the responsibilities. And it's really to reiterate to Birling that he must accept. To accept one, you have to accept the other, but that's something that Birling finds very hard to deal with. Birling was the ex-Lord Mayor. He has public and private responsibilities, and yet he seems unfit for those responsibilities. As a public man, he should do the right thing. He should have been aware, as the Lord Mayor, he should have been aware of the plight of girls like Eva. Yes, he was aware, but it didn't stop him doing anything to help them, because what he did was he put his personal responsibility towards himself as this capitalist above any public responsibility he had as a Lord Mayor to look after the people of the town. And just like you have with Mrs. Birling, she does that too. She puts her personal responsibility of being, I am Mrs. Birling, I must safeguard my reputable name. She puts that above the public responsibility she had to look after a young woman who came to her charity when that young woman was in desperate need. Birling shows too where his loyalties lie. When Mrs. Birling talks about what happened with Eva, Mr. Birling says, "Oh, the press might easily take that interest in the scandal," and there you have that idea that scandal and Birling making sure that his hope of a knighthood remains intact is something that he is completely aware of, to the point where he criticizes his wife because of it. Now, this is a man who has been under his wife's thumb the whole time. Let's see, overly devoted to his wife. And you have to wonder, is he uxorious? Is he overly devoted to his wife because he realizes that she is his social superior rather than just the love of his life? And also too, remember that Birling is a weak character. He is weak in so many ways, and his actions with Eva, rather than delegate, he just sacked her, and he's weak in relation to his relationship with his wife. Okay, again, as a father, you see faults within Birling. Whenever Eric returns and he needs a drink, Mr. Birling acts explosively when the inspector says that he can have a drink. And that's not just because of Eric and drinking. That's because of Birling believing that that is encroaching upon his patch, encroaching upon his power as a parent. But what it also does is it shows to the audience that the inspector has an ability to understand Eric more than his father does, and it gives you that idea of this cold parenting, that Eric and his dad are not close, that his dad doesn't understand Eric in the way that the inspector does. What also you have that comes out of that particular scene is the idea of the tension, because when Eric admits to having stolen the money from the office, the only thing that Mr. Birling wants to do is to cover that up. He doesn't want his son to accept responsibility. He doesn't want to protect his son. It's not about protecting his son. It's protecting the good name of Birling's, ensuring that this is, because it's a crime, so protecting the good name of Birling. So he would rather cover up his son's mistakes, therefore preventing his son from learning anything, because he must safeguard the Birling name. Now, you always have to talk about counter argument, and you have to see things in relation to what could there be good in relation to the characterization of Birling. You know, what positive points could you make about him? Now, J.B. Priestley does not want you to like Birling. He's a shallow, superficial, two-dimensional, flat character. He's the archetypal capitalist. Therefore, you're not meant to like him, and you can't really. But there are things that you must understand. First of all, in his narrow-minded capitalistic viewpoint, is he not providing for his children? Yes, he is. Does he not have this relationship with his wife that suggests that there's affection there, perhaps that come, that placatory thing? Yes, you could say that. But also too, when it comes out about what Eric has done, and they're going into the details of the illicit affair between Eric and Daisy Renton or Eva, what Mr. Birling does is he takes command for the first time, because he knows that Eric has done something awful. He knows that what's about to be spoken of is immoral, and he doesn't want his wife to have to listen to that. So he takes sharp command, as the stage direction says. He takes control for the first time since the inspector has actually arrived, and he speaks in a gentler manner to his wife, because he wants to show, or as he does show here, that there must be genuine affection for her, that he doesn't want her to be upset by what is about to be disclosed. And the inspector doesn't interject. The inspector allows Birling to have this moment of command, and perhaps that implies to us for the first time that Birling is doing the responsible thing, that he's looking after his wife and he's trying to look after his daughter. Now, that has to be there somewhere in a question about Birling, because it is perhaps the one indisputable thing where Birling is acting in a responsible way, where Birling is being a good husband. The audience can feel that this is building up towards something that's quite threatening. Mrs. Birling does leave, but does come back, because she can't bear not hearing what has happened. She always has to be involved in everything, doesn't she? But you have this idea that it does become threatening, and just at the point, like in Act 3, where you have this idea that Birling acts in a responsible manner, well then that is then underpinned or undercut by him acting in a completely irresponsible manner, where he threatens violence against Eric because of Eric's vehement attack on his mum. Does Birling learn anything? Not really, because even when the inspector is leaving, and when the inspector challenges each one of them as to their responsibilities in the death of Eva, Birling says that he would give thousands. Okay, he would give thousands. But the idea is, again, money is paramount with him. He thinks that money solves everything, that money is in some sort of God that can exculpate or can free you from blame, that by throwing thousands at this problem, it'll take away the responsibility that he has. Now that's okay. You can say that he becomes less hard-hearted, i.e. he understands that what happened to Eva was terrible, but it doesn't change his viewpoint. He's still a capitalist. He still thinks that money can solve everything. And as the inspector says, you're giving money at the wrong time. He was asked for an increase in pennies. By the end of Act 3, he would give thousands. And the amount of money isn't the issue. It's the fact that money is still his primary motivation. It's still the first thing that he thinks of. Shows that he doesn't really understand. When Birling talks to Eric about what Eric did, Birling says to him, "Why didn't you come to me?" And Eric says, "You're not the kind of chap a father would go to when he's in trouble," which is a terrible criticism. And again, this idea that the younger generation could be so obviously harsh in their criticism of the older generation is something that would have been seen as quite rebellious and quite controversial in 1912. But also what it does is it shows how Birling is an inept parent, but also that he's totally unaware that he's an inept parent. Why didn't you come to me? He actually thinks he's a responsible parent who is approachable. Again, this lack of awareness is something that comes out every time Birling seems to open his mouth. When Eric honestly tells his dad that you're not the kind of chap that a fellow can go to when he's in trouble, rather than take that on board, what does Birling do? He switches the tables and accuses Eric of being spoilt. So when Eric actually is honest with his dad, Birling can't take that. He then just attacks Eric again for being spoiled. And again, if we think about that self-awareness, where is the self-awareness when he doesn't even realise that it is he who has spoiled him? It is Mr. Birling who spoiled him with his money. Again, linking back to money being the first thing, these children have grown up in a world where they have been, where they have had economic wealth. They haven't had emotional wealth. There's no emotional richness in their lives. They're emotionally poor, economically rich. And the fact that the parents don't realise that is something that we as an audience must blame them for. What also you have is the idea of Mr. Birling as a hypocrite, because when the inspector leaves, the first thing that Mr. Birling does is he pours himself a drink and he swallows it hastily, just like a man used to drink. He takes a drink to steady his own nerves, and yet he acted explosively when his son tried to do the very same thing in Act 3. So you've got that nice little mirroring of action, and here it's done to show the hypocrisy of Birling. Now, as I said before, there's limited understanding with Birling. He hasn't really changed. Again, what he does is he thinks about his knighthood, and he tries to justify, he thinks about privilege and tries to forget about any responsibility. There's every excuse for what your mother and I did. And what he does is he shows himself to be immature and self-centered. And that's something that now his kids can pick up on, and that we as an audience can clearly see. And there is that role reversal, because when we started this play, you could perhaps have thought of Eric as immature. You definitely saw Sheila as self-centered. And yet those same flaws that were in the younger generation are now very apparent in the older generation at the end of the play. So there is that key idea of role reversal. And of course Sheila says it's you two who are being childish. She understands the lack of moral development that their parents have. Eric has the opportunity here to mock his dad. Something that he wouldn't have done. That half shy, half assertive young man in Act 1, you can never imagine him mocking his dad in such a very clear way. He says every man for himself speech, and again that was at the point when the inspector arrived, a very crucial arrival just at the point where Birling had exposed himself as being this sort of archetypal capitalist and a foolish one who was losing track of what he was saying. If you think back to Act 1, at the point where the inspector arrived, Birling started to repeat himself, increase use of hyphens, showing a lack of cogency in his argument. He was blustering. He's committed to this cause, though perhaps doesn't have the intellectual capacity to see it through or to understand it completely. What you also have with Birling is this idea that we've been had, the repetition of we've been had, clearly uniting himself with Gerald, who goes to investigate whether they've been had. And the fact that these two men are looking to expose the inspector as the fraud is ironic, because they both believe themselves to be highly influential, important men within their societies, but they're frauds because they're selfish men. They're men without responsibility. They're both men who use and exploit those who are vulnerable, just as Birling exploited his workers for the lowest price that he could, and Gerald exploited Eva by keeping her in that house and making love to her, even though he knew that she felt so much more for him than he did for her, even though he realised that as a working class girl she could never be part of his world, even though he was engaged to Sheila. Okay, what you have with the inspector and Birling is that once Birling has worked out the inspector is a fraud, he regains his confidence. He is the sort of man who in some ways rebuilds himself as soon as he gets the opportunity to. So it's not as if he can look at himself and think, okay, let's review what I may have done wrong here. All he tries to do is re-establish the persona that he had at the start of Act 1. And you have that too in the idea that he's scornfully critical of his own children. There's no sort of parental feeling there whatsoever. He believes that he can criticise them. He feels empowered. Criticising them makes him feel better about himself. And that's quite cheap, and that's quite nasty as a parent. Birling thinks that he's been taken in by a trick, an illusion. And there's irony there, because he lives in a world of illusion. A world where wealth and selfishness can make you think that you're that you're untouchable, that nothing that you do will have an impact that will be negative upon you or your family. This idea that he can operate with impunity, that he can never be punished for it. He's built a wall up, like his wife says in Act 2, like Sheila points out to Mrs. Birling in Act 2. He's built a wall up, and he's imprisoned in that wall, in this world where wealth and selfishness make him believe that he's more than what he actually is, whereas we can see him as a selfish, weak, self-centered man. There is that idea that Birling is stupid at some point. Now, obviously he's clever enough to build himself up and to work his way up that corporate ladder and to have his own business and to be elected Lord Mayor and to be on the waiting list of the New Year's honours list. So there's a degree of cleverness there, but his stupidity perhaps links to his short-sightedness, his inability to see beyond his own little world. And you have that here, because what you have is, as all the pieces fall into place, Birling is overjoyed and relieved that he even dares to imitate the inspector. He tries to mock the inspector. And what that does is it shows that he's unwilling to accept responsibility. No matter how clearly it's explained to him, he'll always find a way out. Moral responsibility is not something that he ever wants really to be in contact with. He will always find a way out. And that's one of the things that you have to remember, that moral lessons have been taught here, and Birling and his wife have refused to learn from them. Okay, Birling was right in one thing. He said to Gerald, "You're just the kind of son-in-law I've always wanted," and that's what Gerald just turns out to be. But what we can see is that perhaps this capitalistic, morally reprehensible young man that Gerald is at times, that is someone that actually is certainly not worthy of Sheila's love and affection. The fact that Birling wants Sheila to get the ring back, it really is a clear understanding of how stupid and short-sighted that Birling is, because he really thinks that the feelings of the past can be completely eradicated. Okay, this is a moment where he feels empowered and triumphant, that the past can be forgotten, it can be rewritten, it can be just added as a mere detail. And the fact that he believes his daughter would act like that shows how out of touch he is with her. Finally, you have that cliffhanger ending, and the tension is restored very dramatically with the telephone call, and you feel that it's deserved. And perhaps because of the circularity of this narrative, maybe given another chance, Birling will learn something. But I would have to say that Birling is such a flat character, that he is so two-dimensional, that no opportunity is going to be great enough for him actually to open his eyes and see beyond his little narrow path towards capitalism and success.